In a time when darkness enveloped the lives of many, when people suffered from incurable sickness, famine, and war, Gothic art allowed light to penetrate the gloom. Upon entering a Gothic cathedral, one could be transported to another world, a world where light permeated all and God could be felt everywhere. In contrast to the preceding Romanesque style, which focused heavily on depictions of darker biblical scenes, such as the Last Judgment, Gothic art showed a softer side of Catholicism. Where Romanesque architecture was solid, plain, and had little decoration, Gothic architecture was ornate, delicate, and heavily embellished. The term Gothic was first applied to art in the 16th and 17th centuries in a derogatory sense, to denote art which possessed, in general, a pre-Renaissance and non-Italian appearance. Italians viewed the Goths as barbarians, and blamed them for the destruction of classical Roman art. Also, art of the Renaissance was designed to appeal to the intellect. Italians valued order and structure, and wanted to be able to rationalize their art. Gothic art was just the opposite. It was not supposed to be rationalized, but felt. Gothic art was centered around mysticism, and was meant to inspire awe and devotion. Architecture was the most important and original art form during the Gothic period. The principal structural characteristics of Gothic architecture arose out of medieval masons' efforts to solve the problems associated with supporting heavy masonry ceiling vaults over wide spans. There are several characteristics that distinguish Gothic architecture, the most notable perhaps being the flying buttress. Prior to the Gothic era, simpler hidden supports existed. This new architectural element allowed for more light to illuminate the interior of the building and gave it the airy quality that was unique to Gothic churches. The flying buttress is the defining external characteristic of Gothic architecture. These buttresses effectively spread the weight of the new designs, taking the weight off the walls and transferring the force directly to the ground. The flying buttress only became popular, however, after they appeared on the reconstruction of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis. While the architect of Saint Denis is unknown, it is traditionally held that Gothic art makes its debut with the patronage of the Abbot Suger. Abbot Suger decided to rebuild the church in 1137, employing entirely new ideas and techniques which would set new standards of technical excellence. However, what's particularly notable about the flying buttress is that it's decorative too. Rather than just being a simple support, buttresses were often elaborately designed and extremely ornate. They appeared to dart and sweep around each building, giving a sense of movement and grandeur missing from previous architectural designs. Another characteristic of Gothic architecture is the soaring design and continual movement upward. While Romanesque churches were of modest height and horizontal, Gothic churches were tall and vertical. Prior to the Gothic era, early medieval architects were unable to spread the weight of heavy stone walls. Because of this, towers needed to be short, otherwise the sheer weight of higher levels or large rooms and halls would collapse into themselves. In contrast to these short, early medieval buildings, one of the fundamental characteristics of Gothic architecture was its height. New building techniques enabled architects to spread the weight of taller walls and loftier towers. This all meant that Gothic buildings could, quite literally, scale new heights. It allowed them to reach up to the heavens, which would have been an important component of a cathedral at the time. An example of this soaring design is Salisbury Cathedral in England. Built between 1220 and 1258, it has the tallest church spire in the United Kingdom. One element that allowed for Gothic churches to be so tall and ethereal was the pointed arch. The main difference between Romanesque and Gothic arches lies in the pointed shape of the latter, which, besides introducing a new aesthetic dimension, has the important consequence of reducing the arch thrusts by as much as 50%. The pointed arch effectively distributed the force of heavier ceilings and bulkier designs, and could support much more weight than previous simple pillars. The weight of the roof, rather than being supported by the walls, was now supported by the arch, allowing the building to be thinner. Not only did the pointed arch allow for extreme heights to be achieved, but it was also known as the defining internal characteristic of Gothic architecture. While all Gothic churches display the pointed arch, Rheims Cathedral is an exceptionally beautiful example. Built between the years of 1211 and 1275, Rheims Cathedral was the site of numerous royal coronations, which is made apparent through the high placement of the King's Gallery above the rose window. In addition to the pointed arch, vaulted ceilings also made it possible to support the immense height and weight of Gothic cathedrals. Prior to the Gothic era, barrel vaults and groin vaults were used, which presented certain obstacles. The problem was that the heavy stonework of the traditional arched barrel vault and the groin vault exerted a tremendous downward and outward pressure, thus collapsing them. Consequently, a building's vertical supporting walls had to be made extremely thick and heavy in order to contain the barrel vault's outward thrust. In contrast, vaulted ceilings utilized the technology of the pointed arch to spread force and weight from upper floors. The arch also provided the impression of height and magnificence, giving the vaulted ceiling a feeling of elegance. Because of these new innovations in architecture, artists were now able to place stained glass in the windows of cathedrals. In the Romanesque way of thinking, decoration of any kind would detract from God's teachings, and therefore was not allowed. In the Gothic mindset, however, it was believed that beautiful decorations, such as stained glass, would help to bring one closer to divinity. These beautifully ornate windows captured the essence of the Gothic spirit, inspiring emotion and adoration in the viewer. In addition to stained glass windows being incredibly beautiful to look at, they had a practical purpose as well. In a time when the majority of the population was illiterate, stained glass windows could be used as a tool to teach the public. As its popularity rose, mainly during the mid-12th century, the increased presence of stained glass presented major changes to the way the general populace was learning about religion. The windows became illuminated visual sermons of biblical stories, which may have had an even greater impact than the spoken word of the priest. An example of stained glass being used for didactic purposes is the Tree of Jesse, which survived the fire of Chartres Cathedral. Constructed around 1150, this stained glass window depicts the lineage of Christ, based on this passage out of the book of Isaiah. "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." Perhaps the most remarkable example of stained glass resides in the Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, France. Commissioned by King Louis IX, it contains one of the most comprehensive collections of 13th century stained glass anywhere in the world. It was built to house King Louis's collection of relics, which was appropriate because Sainte-Chapelle was itself like a precious reliquary turned inside out, with the richest decoration on the inside. The walls of the chapel are dominated by stained glass, giving it a delicate framework. The stained glass depicts a number of biblical scenes from both the Old Testament and the New Testament, as King Louis IX was eager to position himself as the central monarch of Western Christendom. In addition to standard stained glass windows, which normally fit into the pointed arch, the rose window was also an important element of the Gothic spirit. The term rose window was coined around the 17th century because of the way the windows were constructed in a circular shape, with layered radiating panels giving them an appearance similar to that of an open rose. This window operates on many levels: spiritual, meditative, and emotional. The instructional aspect of the rose window is plainly visible by the subjects chosen for display in each panel, which could be any number of things, including the medieval calendar year, the virtues and vices, the saints, etc. The window itself is a descendant of the Roman oculus, which is a small round opening in the wall. During the Romanesque period, this opening developed into a window. Finally, during the 12th century, as the architectural advances of the Gothic period allowed for greater and greater openings, the size of this round window increased until it reached its greatest dimensions, the width of the entire nave. A stunning example of a rose window can be found on Amiens Cathedral, which is a Roman Catholic cathedral located in Amiens, France. While it is true that the majority of architectural innovations of the Gothic era arose out of a desire to bring more light and beauty into the buildings, there was one element that was constructed for an entirely different purpose. Gothic gargoyles, which came about in the early 13th century, are decorative, monstrous little creatures perched along the roofs and battlements of Gothic buildings. Although one might think that gargoyles were purely meant for decoration, they had a practical purpose as well. They were water spouts, enabling rainwater to drain off the roof and gush through their mouths before plummeting to the ground. While this was indeed practical, gargoyles had another intended purpose: to strike fear into the hearts of ill-educated medieval peasants, scaring them into the church or cathedral. Many gargoyles included elements of the grotesque, exaggerated, evil features or threatening poses, which would have leered down at the peasants from up high. They depicted a number of unpleasant things, including ugly human faces, animals, mythical creatures, and chimeras, which combined several animals to make a truly frightening creature. Gargoyles' history dates back to antiquity. Gargoyles can be found in ancient Egyptian, ancient Roman, and ancient Greek architecture, although they are most commonly associated with medieval Gothic architecture. Ancient history, myths, legends, and pagan religions abound with stories of frightening and fantastic creatures. Creatures that fired the imagination. Creatures you would only ever meet in your worst nightmares. Perhaps the medieval church wanted to convey a terrifying impression of hell, and enforce that there was safety and sanctity inside the church. The devil would have been a most inappropriate and totally unorthodox image to allow in a church. Fantastic gargoyles would, however, have a similar, terrifying psychological effect. Nonetheless, not everyone was in favor of these multifunctional creatures. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was famous for speaking out about superfluous spending in the Catholic Church, spoke out once again against these bizarre creations. He said, "What are these fantastic monsters doing in the cloisters before the eyes of the brothers as they read? What is the meaning of these unclean monkeys, these savage lions and monsters? To what purpose are here placed these creatures, half beast, half man, or these spotted tigers? I see several bodies with one head, and several heads with one body. Here is a quadruped with a serpent's head, and there a fish with a quadruped's head, and then again an animal half horse, half goat. Surely if we do not blush for such absurdities, we should at least regret that we have spent on them." Although Saint Bernard of Clairvaux did not agree with the many attributes of the gargoyles, they continued to adorn Gothic churches for many years after. A fantastically frightening example of these grotesque creatures can be found on Notre Dame in Paris, France. Despite the fact that some might blame the Goths for the fall of classical Roman art, it cannot be denied that the innovations of Gothic architecture of the 12th and 13th centuries were indeed extraordinary. Although many of the Gothic artists and architects remain unknown, they contributed numerous stylistic ideas and techniques that are still used today. From the soaring design of the cathedrals to the delicate stained glass of the rose windows, all of the elements of Gothic art come together to generate a metaphysical experience which is truly remarkable.